All right, so we're back talking about depth and width in your mix. And in the first video in this series, we talked about how to set up your panning and your faders. But today is a large deep dive just into delay and reverb and how that can be used to create a realistic sense of depth and width. But delay and reverb is a really big topic. And so we're going to dive pretty deep today into how and why we do what we do when we're creating a sound space. So let's take a look at this. So before we get too far into the weeds, into reverbs and delays, I want to talk about two important things that you can do as a mix engineer to really up your game and get yourself more professional sounding mixes and get the most out of the depth and width that you're creating. And the first one is to use auxiliary sends instead of putting your effects directly on the channel strip. Now, if you're a newer engineer and you've been shy of using auxiliary sends, I want to highly encourage you to break out of that habit and explore your particular DAW and figure out how to send delays and reverbs from auxiliary tracks into your instruments. If you take the time to learn how to do that, you'll never regret it. It's absolutely fantastic and it really does up your game. And let me show you why. So let's take a listen to this acoustic guitar and this vocal. These are both dry with no effects on them. All right, now let's bring in a big reverb on the vocal, like a big hall, the kind we all know and love. So that's awesome. She sounds like she's in a really large hall and it sounds great. And this is with this reverb directly on the channel strip of the vocal. But now let's turn it up a bit and say we want it to be a lot bigger. And I want to show you what happens to the vocal. Now that's a much bigger reverb than you might want to use, but the point is as you get more reverb, the vocal disappears. It no longer sounds like it's right in front of you in a big hall. Now it sounds like she's more in the back of the hall. And that's because this reverb is directly on the channel strip. All right, so here she is dry again, and then we're going to turn up the reverb to the same level, but we're going to do it through the auxiliary send, and you'll be able to hear how her voice still stays present, like she's right in front of you on the stage, but we end up gaining the same depth of the large hall that we imagine that she's singing in. That's why you want auxiliary sends. Don't be shy. If you haven't figured out how to do this on your DAW, just take the time to look it up. You'll get way more out of all of your effects, your reverbs and delays, and anything else that you're doing. There's so many reasons to use auxiliary sends, but this is a big one. If you want to create a realistic sense of depth and width, you're going to need to do this. So I can't encourage that enough. So that's number one. And the second thing is to get to know your plugins. Especially when you're a newer mix engineer, it's really easy to just pull up some reverbs and flip through some presets and see what you like, but not really know what all the knobs mean and what they're doing. Then take the time to look up the videos or download the manuals on those. Most of those are available as free PDF downloads, and get to know what all those extra knobs do and what they mean, because the more you can customize your effects, the more you can create realistic spaces. So it will totally be to your advantage to do that, to just set that time aside and learn those plugins inside and out. And that leads us right into the larger topic of depth and width in terms of delay and reverb, is if you're using auxiliary sends and you know how to create specific spaces with your delays and your reverbs, that's when you can really start to up your mixing game and customize a realistic sound for all of your instruments and vocalists to live in and make it sound like they're sharing the same space but in slightly different places in that space. So if you think about it, you go to a concert, say you're in a big venue, and you have everyone on the stage in front of you, you have the sound of the room, but there's a lot more going on when you're actually standing in front of a stage. That's the obvious part. The less obvious part is also equally important, and that's all the little tiny short delays and short reverbs that make up the sound of the instruments bouncing off of the stage, bouncing off of the walls on the sides and behind the stage. Think about the sound an acoustic guitar makes as it's bouncing off the drum kit before it hits you. Those are all very minor, but they're very important in terms of keeping it realistic. If you want a realistic sounding soundscape, you're going to need those early delays and short reverbs to create a realistic space. And that's going to be the topic of the bulk of this video. We're going to dive into that stuff first, and then later we'll get to the longer reverbs and longer delays, which imply the larger room as a whole. And we could kind of break down this concept into 2 easy steps as well. I like to think of it as near field or close immediate space, and far field or the grand expanse of all of the space. So those long reverbs, that's your far field. That's telling you how big and how wide and how tall the actual room or venue is. But the near field tells you all of the little details about what's up close and personal and right in front of you. And that's the stuff that often gets overlooked by newer engineers, because when you use it correctly, they're not distracting. If you do it right, it's all very, very subtle, but it creates a sense of depth and width of the near field that's super, super important. So that's where we're going to start. Let's dive into that. So there's a number of ways of creating the near field experience for the listener. And one of the things that you might do is use multiple effects send tracks to generate different reverbs and delays that are all set to the near field settings. And then you can use different tastes of those reverbs and delays on the different instruments. So let me show you what I mean by that. If you see down in the bottom right here, I have a short reverb and a short delay. And on the vocal and on the acoustic and piano and so on, I can use different amounts of short reverb and short delay, so it's not the same on every instrument, and you can kind of start to customize the space that they're living in on the stage. I might use a little more short reverb on the acoustic and very little short delay, and I might use more of the short delay on an electric guitar off to the side and less of the short reverb. And that's just one easy way to customize your immediate near field space. There is more to it, and we'll get to that later. But first of all, let's dive into reverb and delay in terms of near field. So when you're flipping through your presets on your reverbs, it's very common to see things like this. Like this one has a preset for a bathroom, an empty room, a small room. And those are all very useful, and you turn them on and you kind of hear what you expect. Now, you don't usually want to listen to an acoustic guitar in a bathroom, so you probably would skip right over that one and never want to use it. But the reason it's there is because that's utilizing what's known as, in reverb terminology, as early reflections. So when we think of that near field space, early reflections are the immediacy of the first bouncings of the sound around things that are close to it. So naturally, in a bathroom, you're in a tight space, so all of the reverberation is very immediate, and then it fades away very fast because there's not a large space for it to occupy and bounce off. So small room settings and reverbs are really important, even if you're trying to portray a really big venue, because the early reflections happening on the stage in front of you, and those little bouncings off the back of the stage and off the floor, and the guitar bouncing off the drum kit and all that stuff, that could all be classified as early reflections. And in terms of delay, that could all be thought of as short delays, very, very fast delays. And what you do is you build a soundscape of early reflections, and then you dial those way back into where they're almost imperceptible. Like I said, if you hit mute, you would notice it. But when they're on, it's not distracting to the listener, but it gives the subconscious and subtle implications of where these things are in the near field. Like, for example, let's listen to the acoustic in the bathroom. You can hear that this sounds like an acoustic in a very, very small space. And honestly, it's not very pleasant. That's not something you really want to listen to. But that's not really the point. Now let's go to a small room. All right, that's a little more pleasant. It sounds a little more realistic, like you might actually listen to someone playing a guitar in a space like this. So what you do with something like this is you turn it way down. So now we have a sense of near field early reflection going on around this acoustic guitar. Bring it up a little more. All right, and now I'm going to mute the reverb so you can hear the contrast of turning it on and turning it off. Yeah, very subtle. It's not going to be distracting to the listener, but once you start to add up early reflection, near field information into all of the instruments on the stage, they all start to have their own little presence and characteristic that is so much more than if they were dry. And if you turn it all off at once after you've done that for all your instruments, you'll notice a huge difference. There's a sense of aliveness and immediacy, and there's movement going on. And you're still going to use those long reverbs and long delays to imply the larger space, but don't overlook these near field small space settings. They're very important. Now let's go ahead and add a near field delay to this acoustic. So that's a near field delay that's giving an immediate echo. And obviously that's way too much. We don't want that. But if we dial it way, way back, now that's more like what you would hear from an acoustic, slightly bouncing off of the piano next to it and the drum kit next to it and so on. So this is implying realistic space. And then what you would do is you could have more send tracks for the different instruments. You might do these settings on the acoustic and do a slightly different setting on the other instruments. And let's talk about those settings. When I'm talking about getting to know your plugins, this is why. So pre-delay, very commonly overlooked or misused. Pre-delay is the amount of time before the reverb actually starts responding to the input signal. So now we're going to listen to this reverb on this guitar turned back up so we can really hear it, and we'll increase the pre-delay and you'll hear the reverb start to act on the acoustic later and later and later. And if you crank it up far enough, it actually almost becomes like a delayed reverb. By increasing the pre-delay, what you're telling the listener subconsciously is that this instrument is further back away from them on the stage than the same reverb with a shorter pre-delay on another instrument. So this is another way to create depth very subtly. And then same thing, you'll do these at full volume, more reverb than you would want in your final mix so you can really hear it, and then you'll dial it back till it's almost imperceptible. So let's try this again now with this longer pre-delay and dial it back to the background. See, that's pretty nice. And another important thing isn't just the pre-delay. The other settings in the reverb, depending on the brand of reverb, they're going to call different settings different things. You might have a reverb that says shape, and you might have one that says contour. So that's where you really want to get to know your plugins, is because you can create custom spaces here. And the more that you know how to do that, and the more you take the time to learn it and you customize that, you'll get much more out of your depth and width in that near field experience for your listener. And we're going to tackle the same thing with the short delay. Now in this delay, I have the ping pong turned on, which means it's going in stereo. So each slapback is going left and right, left and right. And this is super useful too, but you might do this on this acoustic and change these settings so the slaps are a slightly different time, shorter or longer for the other instruments. And that way you can give the impression that these instruments are in slightly different positions on the stage in front of you. So let's dial this back to where it's a reasonable, almost imperceptible volume. Turn up that reverb a little more. So now there's no long reverb on this yet, so we're not hearing the impression that this acoustic is in a big space at all yet. But I recommend before you do the long reverbs and the long delays, you customize your near field and get it the way you want it to create space. So just to drive it home, we're going to listen to this now, and then we're going to turn both of the short reverb and short delay off and listen to it dry and go back and forth. So you can really hear it when you mute it and bring it back on, and that's what you want. You don't want it to be distracting for the listener, but we've created a lot of realistic space that this acoustic is apparently living in on this stage somewhere, and then you can bring in your longer reverb. And now we can hear the larger room that this acoustic is sitting in. So this is one of the biggest points I wanted to drive home. Use effects sends and get to know your plugins and create customized short near field spaces with early reflections and short delays, and then utilize your bigger room spaces and customize those as well. and that will give you a very, very realistic space that you're creating here. So we're going to leave the acoustic and dive into a couple other examples. We're going to go to the vocal next and do kind of the same thing. All right, so what I've done here for the vocal is I've taken the short reverb effects send track that we used for the acoustic, and I've duplicated that track and simply renamed it as short reverb for vocal. And this is something that if your CPU can handle it, you'll gain a lot of benefit by not using the same short reverb and delay for all of your instruments. If you can duplicate them and change the parameters a little bit, that's going to help a ton, because then you can customize their near field presence on your virtual stage that you're trying to create. And you can have them all be just slightly different, not dramatically, but changing the pre-delay a little bit, the shape, the contour, and the size, all by tiny amounts. It adds realism to the overall experience. So let's listen to the vocal and the acoustic now. The vocal is dry, and then we're going to bring in that short reverb again for the immediate near field space on it, and take a listen. And since that's the exact same reverb, we're going to adjust the settings a little bit. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make the vocal sound like it's slightly in front of that acoustic guitar. So we're actually going to increase the balance of early and late, and then we're going to increase the late gain a little bit and decrease the early gain a little bit. And this is going to change all of those early reflections by a minute amount. So they're sharing the same reverb settings as far as the time and decay goes on the reverb, the diffusion. This one has a setting for liveliness and so on. And the high cut frequency on the reverb, I'm leaving exactly the same. So this implies that the acoustic and the vocal are right next to each other, but just a few feet apart. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to decrease this pre-delay quite a bit. I do not want that slapback effect from this reverb on the vocal. The reflection settings will do minute changes, but this is going to make that vocal sound like it's right in front of us, but still on the same stage as the acoustic. So let's take a listen. Very nice. So that's still more than we would want. I would dial that back until it's very, very subtle. But now that we have some early reflection short reverb on the vocal, let's bring in the delay, because we want some short delay on this vocal to give more sense of width and space up on that stage that she's on. But here's where I want to add an extra layer to the mix. So now I'm going to show you a different method where instead of having a separate effects send for the delay, for this vocal, we're actually going to put the delay on in the effects chain of the reverb set. And this is part of a really large topic that I'm not going to dive too deep into in this video. I'm going to do more videos on this. But the point here is that reverbs and delays sound better and more realistic if you have other reverbs and delays on those reverbs and delays. This is a trick of the pros. Instead of just using a reverb to gain an effect, you can also add a little delay very subtly onto that reverb, and vice versa. And then you can stack them and you can duplicate that process over and over. Not only does it give a more realistic sense of space, but it makes every individual reverb and delay less noticeable because there's more going on in it. There's more movement. So we're going to just do this as one example here, and then, like I said, in future videos, I'll get deeper into this because this is where it gets really fun and really takes you to kind of a pro level in terms of creating ambience. So our vocal slapback delay now, like I said, instead of on a separate effects send track, I'm putting it immediately after the reverb. So now the delay is actually responding to the reverb and not to the dry signal of the vocal. So let's play our reverb again, and then I'm going to add this slapback delay on top of it so you can hear the difference.
Oh, yeah, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah, yeah, oh, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. That is a great technique. And the same thing, if you were going to do a short delay, you could add reverb onto that delay. So that is an absolutely fantastic trick. And then before we leave this vocal, I want to show you another thing that's really, really important. Don't hesitate to EQ your reverbs and your delays. So what I've done here is roll all of the bottom off of this reverb and delay. So now I'm going to play the reverb and delay again on the vocal, and then I'll turn on the EQ with the low end of it rolled off so you can hear how it's not muddying up the low end. So See, you can hear how that's going to cut through a mix a lot better. And in the context of all the drum and bass and stuff going, you really don't need the reverb and the delay on a vocal down in the low range. And likewise, let's say you're really enjoying the ambiance you're creating, but it's a little too bright in the mix, just roll off the high end.
Oh, yeah, yeah, oh, yeah.
You know, a great vocal trick is to add a little bit of air, a little bit of boost at 11 or 12K. But instead of doing that, which totally works, you could also do it to your effects send. Two ways of approaching the same thing, but take a listen to it with a little air on the top. You know, very cool. And then one other thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to turn on a little bit of distortion. If you've never heard of this trick, give it a try, because if you saturate your reverbs and your delays, you're actually adding harmonic overtone content into the reverb and delay that was not there before. So we all know that a little bit of saturation on a vocal can sound really good, but it's easy to overdo. But you can totally saturate your reverbs and delays and make them sound way grander without having to turn them up. So let's go ahead and listen to her again with that reverb and delay, and then we'll turn on some distortion. Yeah, isn't that awesome?
Yeah, yeah, oh, yeah.
So this works for a vocal, it works for all kind of things, but like anything else, you don't want to overdo it. You don't necessarily have to put distortion and saturation on every single reverb. It's better if you use it selectively and strategically, like most things in your effects chain. I'm going to show you one other twist I've done to this vocal reverb. We're going to have that same reverb duck out of the way when she sings, and then it'll swell up when she's done singing. You do that with the side chain on your effects send. So let me play that for you real quick. So as you can hear, when she stops singing, it swells up from the background and takes the space. This is a really great trick, and I'll lay that out in the next video. And there's a lot more about reverb and delay that we got to get to. I got to show you how to do gated reverbs on snares and just a whole bunch of other things. But these are really great tools, and they're commonly overlooked, especially by newer mix engineers. But this is where you really get the sense of depth and width in the near field right in front of the listener. It's easy to throw a big reverb on your whole mix and make it sound like a great room. And that totally helps. I love it too, and I do that. But don't miss this opportunity of customizing the near field. I highly recommend it. I think you'll really enjoy it, and it'll take your mixing game to the next level. You know, as a mix engineer, you are an artist and you're making artistic decisions. And this is one of the biggest opportunities you have as an artist to enhance the performance of the band. You get to create the space that all of that's living in for the listener. And if you overdo it, it sounds like you're actually detracting from the band's performance. But if you do it tastefully, you're totally enhancing it. So I'm hoping these techniques can help you up your game to enhance whatever you're mixing and make it sound like something way more inviting for the listener to get lost in. To me, that's one of the funnest parts about being a mix engineer, is creating the space that all of this lives in. And your average listener will take all that for granted. They don't understand that this is what we do. But if you get really good at this, your band and the artists that you're working with are gonna love it. But I encourage you to play around with all of these techniques, and don't be shy. Turn up those reverbs and turn up those delays. Just know your gear, know what you're doing and why you're doing it, so you can make sure that you're not overdoing anything and that you're doing it creatively and realistically. But for now, we're gonna leave this here and just play you the full mix with all of this depth and width that we've added into it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and if there's any other topics that you want me to tackle, hit me up and let me know. But I'll catch you on the next one.